so it's divided differently. The PNS is divided into two divisions. The divisions of the PNS is the afferent and the efferent. Now, in the afferent division, it's sensory. There are three types of sensory. There is special sensory, there is somatic sensory, and there's visceral. The special sensory, those are our 5 special senses. They're defined as such because they have their own separate organs that they go to. And the special senses are going to be vision, audition, gustation, equilibriception, and olfaction. That's sight, sound, taste, equilibrium, and smell. The somatic is going to be divided into 6 separate senses. Now, these are also called general senses. They're called general senses because they're throughout the body. They're pretty much everywhere. There is no one specific organ. They're also all collectively referred to as touch in common speech, but they're all separate senses. So you have your actual pressure touch, which is baroception. And we have 2 separate types of receptors for that. We have light touch and we have dark touch. You studied this when you studied the skin in the integument, because you had your Meissner cells and you had your Pacinian corpuscles. So you have baroception, and you have baroception for light touch, and you have baroception for deep touch. In addition to that, you also have temperature senses, which is called thermoception, and you have 2 types of receptors for that. You have warm and cold. So you have thermoception for warm, and you have thermoception for cold. And there are 3 times as many cold receptors as there are warm receptors. We also have pain sense, which is nociception. And there's one that's key to know, is proprioception. That is position of the body. Now, visceral senses are going to be all of the senses that measure internal body conditions. We're not going to go into too much detail on that because there's many, they're varied, they're all over the place. In general, they're broken down into mostly baroception and chemoreception. But these are things like stretch receptors in your intestines that measure whether or not you should continue digestion or slow it down based on how much food is in it. Pressure sensors in your carotid artery that monitor your blood pressure. Most of these we're not even aware of consciously. Some of them we are. For example, stretch receptors in the bladder that tell us that we have to use the bathroom. We're aware of things like that. And when your stomach starts growling, you have stretch receptors in the stomach, and we're aware of that. So some of them we're aware of, some of them we're not, but you're not going to go into too much detail about it because there's way too many, and they're throughout. What you do need to know for sure, though, is that these are how we sense our outside environment, how we sense the world around us. So these 2 collectively are our exteroreceptors. And your visceral organs collectively are going to be your interoreceptors. Because that's going to be inside the body, and these 2 are going to be outside the body. So you got your special senses, you got your general senses, you got your visceral senses. Those are all the components of your afferent division. Now let's move over to the efferent division. The efferent division is actually much simpler. So the efferent division is divided into two separate nervous systems. You have the somatic nervous system, not the same as somatic sensory. This is somatic motor. And you have the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is going to be conscious control of the body. This is voluntary movement, so it's going to control skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is unconscious control of the body and body conditions. So that's going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. In addition to that, the autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. And those divisions are sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the neurotransmitter for parasympathetic stimulation is acetylcholine. And the neurotransmitter for sympathetic stimulation is primarily epinephrine, but there's also some norepinephrine as well. Primarily it's going to be epinephrine, though. Epinephrine is adrenaline. Same stuff. Just a different name, and the names even mean the same thing. Epinephrine, above the nephrons, so above the kidneys. Adrenaline, adrenal, above the kidneys. Means the same thing, referring to the same stuff. Now, sympathetic is going to have your short preganglionic fibers and your long postganglionic fibers. Parasympathetic is going to have long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. Parasympathetic comes entirely off of cranial nerves and some sacral nerves. So there's 3 sacral nerves. You don't have to know their names, but you have to know that there's 3 of them. And the cranial nerves you have to know. The cranial nerves are going to be 4 cranial nerves. Yes. Did I say 3? Okay. 3 sacral nerves, 4 cranial nerves. The cranial nerves you have to know. That's 3, 7, 9, and 10. So it's your oculomotor, your facial, your glossopharyngeal, and your vagus. You also have to know that the vagus nerve provides 75% of all of the parasympathetic stimulation in your body. That's why parasympathetic stimulation is also sometimes called vagal stimulation, because it's referring to the vagus nerve. Now, your sympathetic is epinephrine and norepinephrine. This is not coming straight out from cranial nerves or anything like that. Instead, it comes off of the spinal cord and goes into the sympathetic chain ganglia, also called the paravertebral ganglia. And those guys are going to signal each other so the whole system flashes and then goes out. Now remember when I said sympathetic has short pre, long post? There's 2 exceptions to that rule. Both of those exceptions go through the collateral ganglia. The first exception is all of the sympathetic stimulation of the visceral organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. Those organs come from neurons that are coming out of the sympathetic from the spinal cord, and they go through to the collateral ganglia. They synapse in there, and then they go out to the visceral organs. The second exception comes from the spinal cord through the collateral ganglia without synapsing, and goes directly into the medulla of the adrenal glands. And that is what causes our adrenal gland to release epinephrine directly into our bloodstream. So it synapses in the medulla, whereas the other ones synapse in the collateral ganglia, and their postganglionic go from there. Therefore, for the visceral organs of the abdominopelvic and for the adrenal medulla stimulation, those sympathetic neurons are going to have long preganglionic and short postganglionic. So they're an exception to the norm that sympathetic has short pre, long post. There's no exceptions in parasympathetic. They're all long pre, short post. Yeah. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation are excitatory and inhibitory. Excitatory for some organs, inhibitory for others, and that's true for both. For example, respiration, the heart rate, dilating your eyes, vasoconstriction, that's all going to be excitatory for sympathetic stimulation, whereas digestion and reproduction are going to be inhibitory.
Dual innervation? Is that when dual innervation?
Dual innervation is the fact that organs receive stimulation from both at the same time. Whichever one is producing more determines what mode that organ goes into. Parasympathetic is going to be excitatory for digestion and reproduction, whereas it's going to be inhibitory for your respiration, your heart rate, your eye constriction, and your vasoconstriction. And I think I've pretty much covered it all.